Fantastic. So welcome everyone again to today's session. So we have Lauren here who's going to be speaking to us about the introduction to some different types of research methods. Lauren works with the HDRC and helps with evaluation and other research work. So yeah, over to you, Lauren. Thank you. Also, sorry, we'll be recording the session, so please note that and put off your camera if you don't want to be seen. Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, thanks, Michael. So yeah, hi everybody, my name's Lauren and I work for the Coventry Health Determinants Research Collaboration, so I'm based at Coventry City Council. I think we're quite a small group today, so please feel free to kind of share in the chat any questions as we go along and add comments as I sort of speak. Today's session is a bit of an introduction to different types of research methods, and I'll present for around 30 minutes and then have some time for questions at the end. But it is only 30 minutes, so this is an introduction and I won't be able to go into sort of too much depth about the different research methods, but I'm hoping that by the end of this session you might have a bit of an idea about what sort of training or resources you might want to seek out afterwards. So yeah, I'll cover some different types of research methods in quantitative and qualitative approaches, and I'm hoping by the end of today's session you'll have a bit of an idea about what to consider when deciding on a research method to use if you're planning on doing some research yourself, or how to think critically about research if you're reading somebody else's. And as I said, that might lead you to want to do a bit more training. So first of all, what are research methods? So research methods are a bit like the recipe that's used to carry out research to collect and then analyse data. So this can include the different techniques, procedures and tools that we use to carry out research. And there are many different types. So some might be better suited to certain research topics, aims or questions than others. But that doesn't mean there's definitely a sort of best research method, because all will have their own strengths and limitations, considerations to think carefully about. And I will go through some of those today. And there are lots of decisions to make when carrying out a research project. So starting at the beginning, we're going to be thinking about what questions need answering and really honing in on that question. So what research has come before, what research questions are outstanding that we need to know about our service or our project, what are the aims and purpose of a research, and what data would help us to answer these questions. And also what assumptions we as researchers are bringing, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. These decisions might take us down one or more of qualitative or quantitative approaches, and these are terms that you might have heard of, and I'm going to go through a few different methods from each approach today. So examples of qualitative methods, and do pop in the chat if you've got specific interests in some of these or you want to mention other methods. But qualitative methods typically are about non-numerical data, so that might be sort of words or pictures and that type of thing. And this can include interviews, so where you're sitting down as a researcher or an interview with a participant. You might engage in a semi-structured interview, so that's where you have a list of questions or topics to sort of go through in the interview. You might ask some follow-up prompts or sort of clarification questions. To help the participants sort of answer the research question essentially. Or you might do other types of interviews, so narrative interviews, for example, and this is where you might ask the participant to tell their story about a certain topic. So you're not leading them through the interview asking kind of question after question, but they're just given space to tell their story how they want, in a way that's sort of meaningful to them. That's quite a good way of doing interviews as well sometimes, depending on your contexts and what you want to find out from your research. Focus groups, so this is getting multiple people together to sort of interview them at the same time essentially. You might sort of think about people sat around in a circle, but obviously these days that could also happen online. And with a focus group, you're obviously interviewing several people at once, and something interesting about that is you can look at the different interactions and conversations between people in the group, and maybe you'll find something interesting there for your research question. Creative methods are a more creative way of gaining qualitative data, and there's lots of different methods that fall under this approach. Arts-based and photo elicitation are some methods. So with photo elicitation, this is where a participant gets given a camera or is asked to take photos about sort of meaningful topic in their lives for a period of time, and they then might come together with the researcher to talk about these photos in a sort of interview type format. So a bit more of a creative way of doing things, which can work quite nicely. You can do qualitative surveys, so I'm sure we're all familiar with surveys, and we've probably all completed or administered surveys with open-ended questions. You can also do surveys just with fully qualitative questions, and again, that can be appropriate for some questions. And finally, just the one to touch on today is case studies. So this is a more in-depth look at a specific case, and a case might be a specific person or a specific project or even country, but looking really in depth at that particular case. And just to flag up specifically about case studies, because I think these are something that we see a lot in practice, is just around the ethical considerations. I'm going to talk a bit about the ethical considerations later on, but this is particularly something to be mindful of with case studies. If we're talking about someone's life in more depth, it's extra important to make sure that people know what's being shared about their life, that they're involved in that process. That's just something to think about locally, what sort of guidelines you have locally about how people put together case studies. So it's just something I wanted to flag there. So those are methods to create qualitative data or generate qualitative data, but there are also different methods for analysing qualitative data. And that sort of means the different processes that you might go through, or analytic sort of lenses through which you see qualitative data. So you might have the same transcripts in front of you, but you might take different approaches to analysing those transcripts, for example. So one way is thematic analysis. This is probably one of the more used types of qualitative analysis, where you essentially code the data and try and find meaningful patterns in that data. And the next slide, I'm going to talk through the different stages of this a little bit. But there are also things like discourse analysis. So this is the study of how language is used. So I'm sure there's probably student projects at the moment looking at how leadership debates, politicians, the presidential election, how language is being used in those sorts of environments. Framework analysis is another approach where you'll take a sort of more systematic approach to organising data into a framework, into themes. And grounded theory is another example. So whilst data can be used to test theories, a grounded theory approach is using qualitative data to generate a theory and then then test the theory again. So these are just some of the ways. There are plenty more as well, but just to give you an idea that qualitative analysis can take many different forms as well. So as I said, this is just a bit of the stages you might go through for a type of thematic analysis. So starting with familiarization, and this starts from the point of collecting the data. So if you're doing an interview with somebody or a focus group, you're starting to become familiar with the data at that stage. If you're the one doing the interviews, but you then might transcribe the interview. You might read through the interview again, and all of this process is important to become familiar with the data set that you're generating. The next stage, you will start to code the data. So that essentially is going through the data to identify meaningful aspects, things that relate to your research question. This photo is of a post-it note and pencil, and that's one way of doing that. You might also use things like Excel or Word or type of software, for example, NVivo, to sort of help this coding process. Once you've got your codes, you might look to start generating, or you will look to start generating themes. So that's essentially looking for the patterns in your codes. Where have you got the similar or same codes, you'll be grouping those and starting to generate themes around sort of meaningful concepts in the data. And this process can be quite messy. And I think when you're starting out doing qualitative research, you might feel like you've got it wrong because you've made a decision, but then later on you feel like that decision doesn't quite fit, and actually that code should probably fit in another theme, and you might move things around. And that's perfectly normal and a good process, so don't be too scared of sort of moving things around. You've not got it wrong, there is no getting it wrong, it's just working through the process. So that's sort of revising the themes, and you might do that throughout the process. But once you've sort of settled on your themes, you'll be looking to define them. What does a theme mean? What's the essence of it? and assigning names to those themes. So, you know, what is the sort of story of this theme? And then producing the report. So that's writing up what your themes mean, choosing quotes to illustrate what you're saying in that theme, sort of evidence what participants have contributed. And again, you might continue to make changes even here. So that can be a really iterative approach to developing your report. So that's just one approach that you might take to qualitative analysis. Just going to quickly go through an example project just to showcase some of the decisions that you might make if you're delivering a piece of qualitative research. So this was an evaluation of a nurse-led outreach provision for people who are experiencing homelessness in one local authority. And as part of this evaluation, we wanted to understand what the sort of impact of this service was on people's experiences of accessing healthcare, on their mental and physical health. And we also wanted to know, because these nurses were seconded into a voluntary sector organisation, it obviously involved the local authority and the NHS, we wanted to know what impact that was having on sort of multidisciplinary and collaborative working. So there were two parts to this project. One, we wanted to interview the housing and healthcare professionals involved in the service or involved in the field who might be able to sort of give their perspectives and experiences of the service. We decided to do this with semi-structured interviews because there were specific topics that we wanted to ask about, and we could follow that up with further prompts. We decided to carry these out online, so on Teams predominantly. And that decision was partly because this was during COVID restrictions and lockdown, so that was safer and ethical, but also it was practical because these professionals had busy diaries. They preferred to fit in an online interview, and they were given devices as part of their work, so we didn't have to worry about the barrier of people not having access to Teams because it was part of their sort of professional working. For people who were experiencing homelessness and were eligible or had access to this service, we decided to do narrative interviews. So that's asking them to tell me their story about their experience of accessing healthcare, whether that be traditional healthcare through a GP or emergency department, for example, or via this service. And we felt that was just meant that they could tell their story in a way that was meaningful, in a way that they wanted to. They didn't have to jump into answering questions about their health that maybe they didn't want to, for example. And these were conducted in person. So obviously this happened at a later date when it was safe to do so. But just through sort of talking through the practicalities and the ethical concerns with different stakeholders involved, this just seemed to be the best way forward. And it worked very well in the end. I went out into community spaces, was able to build a bit more of a rapport with people this way, having a coffee beforehand and things like that. So I think this worked out very well. And these were analysed with reflexive thematic analysis, sorry. So the process that I just described was the process that happened here. And as I mentioned, it was really beneficial to involve stakeholders, as in any research project, involving your different stakeholders in developing the methods so that they are, more ethical, appropriate, and feasible for everybody involved. We did have a session in Coventry HDRC last week about involving the public, so definitely check that out if you haven't seen that one. And just to touch on some important considerations then when thinking through research, so having a thought out plan, thinking through the different eventualities. If you're going to offer Teams interviews to somebody, what happens if they don't have access to Teams and they want to take part by phone? How does that influence your gaining of informed consent? So just thinking through some of the practicalities. Ethics and data protection, obviously very, very important. Different organisations might have different procedures, so definitely look to your sort of local guidelines and seek the relevant training and advice. Thinking about accessibility and inclusion, making sure that the participant group you want to engage in your study have equitable access to taking part. Thinking about power imbalances. So if you're wanting to evaluate a service, what does that mean if you're asking a key worker to interview their client about their experiences of a service? You know, that's probably going to raise some risky and ethical issues, and people might not want to be honest, and so on. And again, thinking about your skills and training needs. So research is a team effort, and looking to other colleagues who've done a similar method before is going to be a good way to build your confidence and skills in delivering a piece of qualitative research. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to some quantitative designs. So quantitative designs are more around numbers, and there's different designs and lots of different methods for doing this. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but just to kind of give an overview of some of the key designs. You've got experiments and trials. So this is where you might compare, you might have an intervention, for example, and compare groups, compare before and after people who've been involved in a trial, with different designs of doing that. Descriptive studies are where you're sort of looking for observations in a population or among variables. So you might be looking for associations between different variables. Does the people who are digitally excluded have worse mental well-being, for example? You're just looking at the associations there between those two variables in a group. You might use surveys to do this. Again, I'm sure we're all familiar with designing surveys. But what's important to think about here is the questions you're asking them and the way that they're being asked. HDRC Self-Tease did a very good session on this recently, so I'd recommend looking for that video if you're wanting to learn more about how to design a survey. But just to touch on what validated tools means, there's lots of variables where we can't just test someone's blood pressure or get a sort of factual measure like that. If we're wanting to measure someone's well-being, for example, that's going to require us to ask different questions and sort of putting a figure on that, if you like. So for a tool to be validated, it means it's gone through its own research process. It's been vigorously tested to make sure that we can be confident that a tool is measuring what we think it's measuring, that it might be repeated, and so on. And all of these things might be analysed with statistical data analysis. Again, that's a whole huge topic that I don't have time to go into, but I'm going to touch on some key sort of statistical terms that we might want to think about when we're thinking critically about research. So one is the term statistically significant. I don't know if people want to sort of indicate in the chat if they've heard of this term. I think it's sort of got into sort of general speak. If you're making an argument, people might say, oh, but it's statistically significant. What that essentially means is that the evidence. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, not heard of it. So statistically significant is something that's a really commonly used in statistics to say the conclusion might be, well, my intervention was statistically significant. That means that they were statistically they found a difference between two groups, or they can be confident that that what they're testing was a difference between the two groups. But actually, statistically significant is a measure of probability in statistics and not a measure of real life kind of meaning. So just because something is statistically significant, it doesn't mean it has a real world significance. Sort of related to this is errors. So type point error is where a statistical test leads to the result that yes, something was statistically significant. Yes, my intervention made a difference in these two groups. The group that had the intervention had a better outcome than the group that didn't have the intervention. But actually, a type 1 error means that although you've drawn that conclusion, sort of in reality, there was no difference between the groups. The difference was caused by something else. Whereas a type 2 error is where you've concluded, no, my statistical test says there's no difference between these two groups. My intervention was unsuccessful, but actually, in reality, it was successful. So this is a bit like if you think you have COVID, you take a COVID test and it comes back negative, but actually you do have COVID. That will be a type 2 error. Causation versus correlation. So again, you might have heard of this phrase. There's this website which is quite interesting to look at by this person, Tyler Vegan, who's kind of just got loads of variables together and is just seeing what correlations they can find naturally. So this is one showing that milk consumption is very highly correlated with burglary rates. So this has a correlation of 0.97. That's incredibly high, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other. It's just a naturally occurring correlation, and this has also been found to be statistically significant, shown by this p-value here being very low. So where this happens in research, this example is kind of obvious. We can be quite confident that these two things aren't directly causing each other. There might be a third factor potentially causing the correlation, but they're not causing each other. But in research, this can not be so obvious. So we just need to be very critical if we're reading a piece of research. If they've done, if they're doing a correlation test or an association test to not draw causation out of that. So to give an example about how we can think critically about research, I'm going to take this example from citizen science. So citizen science is a type of participatory research. That's research done with or by the public. And the kind of ethos of it is valuing public expertise and lived experience to answer research questions. So it's kind of intended to make science and research more inclusive and accessible. It could be done in lots of different ways. So for example, in our HDRC, we're planning to run one of these courses where members of the public will conduct their own research. Another way of doing it is where the public are invited to collect and record data on lots of different topics. So it's used quite a lot in ecology. And that's sort of the example I'm going to talk about today, is this big hedgehog map. So this is a sort of national project, if you like, to encourage members of the public to log hedgehog sightings. So if you come across a hedgehog, you can go onto this website and log your sighting, dead or alive, and then you can go on this website and filter by year. So a member of the public can go on and see in their local area, how many hedgehogs have been sighted. So if we look, you might not be able to see the numbers too clearly, but you'll see that there are points on this map with higher numbers than others. So for anyone who's Coventry based, there's quite a lot of sightings around Memorial Park, which is one of Coventry's bigger parks, and some also around Costco, which I think is probably Tower Hill Woods. But there's not much in other places. So if we're having a critical eye on this, one easy conclusion might be there are more hedgehogs in these areas than other areas. But are those the reasons? Is there more hedgehogs in some areas than other areas? Or are there other factors that we need to think about? So it could be that people around Memorial Park have higher awareness of the website. For example, they might have received some leaflets. There might be posters up in Memorial Park advertising this website. Some people in certain areas might have more time to log their sighting. They might be more likely to be retired, for example. Or people in some areas might have more access or skills with technology, more confidence to go on the website and log their sighting. People also could just be going to Memorial Park to look for hedgehogs, or there's simply more visitors in Memorial Park than other parts of the city. So all of these are examples of confounding variables, or where there could be sampling bias. So this is a sort of simple example to show just taking the data at face value doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going on. We need to think critically about other explanations and other explanations for why we're finding the data. But that's not to say that this method is sort of rubbish and we should discount it. Obviously, it's got a lot of benefits. So it's involving the wider public in data and learning about research and learning about ecology. So, this could make a real difference if people go away and build, hedgehog pathways in their garden. It increases capacity for sightings. That means it might flag up certain areas that can be then go and explored further. And there have been real success stories with these citizen science methods, identifying rare bird species and so on. It does overcome barriers associated with professional data collection. So just because a method has lots of limitations, it might also have strengths, and we don't kind of need to just bash all methods. We can look for the positives too. So in summary, if you're designing a research project, you want to be thinking about how to involve people and involve stakeholders in your design and the delivery of your research project to make sure that it's designed in ways that are appropriate and going to answer your research questions as you want it to. That can be supported by having a plan, having clear purpose, aims and questions in that plan, and making sure that your plan is feasible. So if you need data for your service development or whatever by a certain date, what is feasible to achieve in that time, what resources and capacity are available. So if you're wanting to do interviews, for example, and follow a thematic analysis approach, you might be looking at sort of several hours per interview. Is that feasible with the capacity available, or might you need to think about different methods or think about ways to sort of cut down on that resource and still have a robust method? What skills and knowledge are in the team? what further training might the team need. As I said, research is very rarely done alone. Pretty much only if you're a student would you do a research project entirely alone. So bringing in different skills from different colleagues and different members of the team is always going to strengthen your research. Thinking through methods that are ethical, accessible, and inclusive. Looking to local guidelines on that as well. And again, thinking about the different strengths and limitations of a research project. All methods will have limitations, but thinking about these early on in the process, right at the beginning, trying to predict what those limitations will be will help you to mitigate them or make improvements to sort of reduce some of those and maximise the strengths. This last slide just has some resources. So on our HDRC website, we've flagged some sort of key training. There's also our previous webinars on there. And then these other methods these other resources, are just different organisations that deliver different training. So the National Centre for Research Methods includes lots of different resources on there. Brown and Clark's thematic analysis, they've got lots of resources on their website too. Khan Academy for Statistics, and ethical resources on the Open University, and there's plenty more out there. So that's the presentation for this half an hour. So I'd open it up to questions if anybody's got any.